Glad you all are here. Anybody see that sunset this evening? It was beautiful. It was like it was on fire. It was just gorgeous. It's a heat wave. What is it, 19 or 15 degrees? So. Well, let's get started. Let's begin with a prayer. Gracious Lord, we come before you. We thank you for the opportunity to be here tonight. What a privilege and what a blessing. We pray that you'd help us as we begin to prepare for a study of the life of Christ. Help us, Father, to understand the many things that were going on at the time that Jesus came into this world. Help us to realize there are things that we don't know and that we can learn and that may have an impact even on our life today. Help us to see the world in a different way. Pray that you would help us as we look this evening at the Herodian dynasty, that we might understand the things that were going on, the people that were leading the people politically, and help us to understand the feelings that believers had towards folks like that, and help us to see what effect that had on the spread of the gospel and the bringing about of Jesus. Help us, Father, give us wisdom, give us understanding, give us knowledge. Please bless those who couldn't be here tonight. I pray that you would help them to get well soon and be able to be out in our midst again. We're so grateful for your word. Thank you for allowing us to be here tonight to open it up and study it. I pray your blessings. I ask in Jesus' name, amen. I'm doing something I don't usually do. I have no notes tonight, no paper notes. It's right here. If the PowerPoint goes down, we're just toast. Or I'm toast. So we'll look at the Herodian dynasty in the life of Christ, and I found a clip art of a king. He's kind of a mean-looking guy, and I kind of think that's what Herod might have looked like. But question, we're going to start right up here in the front, is with some class input. When the fullness of time came, after 400 years of God's silence, the time was right. God sent forth his son to be born of a woman, born under the law. We read that in Galatians 4:4. So the question becomes, what were some of those conditions that were just right for the coming of Jesus? Now I'm asking you. So this is where you're going to provide some input for just a little bit, and the next slide we'll see if maybe I've got some of the things that you got. Mary? Road system, okay. A road system that allowed people to travel freely and easily. That's good. Anything else? Steve?
Universal language.
A universal language. The Greek Koine language was the language that was used. It was common. It was spread out everywhere, and so people had a common way of communicating where they went. So yeah, good. Roads, language, what else? I just about called on you, Brett. You raised your hand up there.
I'll answer. There was a general peacefulness over the land.
A general peacefulness over the land, okay.
The
Roman rights of citizenship? Yeah, I think that's a really good one. The people had rights that were granted to them because they were citizens of this new Roman kingdom, and some of them, they needed it and they exercised it. John, what do you got?
There were synagogues in many different major cities around.
Okay.
So when the gospel was sent out, it went to people particular people, those Jews that were in the synagogue, they knew God, and they knew of the Old Testament scriptures and what the prophets had said about the Messiah, the one coming. So they could go right to those that had a ready-made audience to teach about God's Son who came, the Christ.
Very good. Synagogues all over the place, and so when Christ came and the ministry started, and then people started getting dispersed everywhere, there was a ready audience ready to hear what was said. And so, very good. Thank you, John.
Enough time had passed from the finishing of the Old Testament to Christ's time that even though some critical textual scholars
good. The prophecies made about Jesus, there's no dispute about when they were written. They were written centuries before Christ. Very good. That's a benefit of 400 years of silence, huh? Yeah. Okay, well, that's a pretty good list. Let's see if I got Roman government, citizen rights, Roman roads, Mary's, ease of travel, common language, Koine Greek, Greek influence. That was the Septuagint was translated into Old Testament, and the Jews were scattered everywhere, and so there was a lot of knowledge of God. And so, anything else before we go on? So, do we think of the Herodian dynasty as part of this in the fullness of time? I didn't. I'm not sure. Now I'm not sure even now if I still do, but the question seems more present in my mind that I would ask this question now. Is the Herodian dynasty something that was providential? Is there some aspect of it? John, what do you think?
Part of it fulfilled scripture after Jesus was born. One of the Herods, I think the first Herod, tried to kill all the babies there.
Yeah. Yeah, so we're going to see some of those, and I'm trying not to overlap into the lessons of the other teachers, but we are going to see some in some scriptures some of these things. We're going to talk about some of these things, but tonight not so much. But yeah. I'm just going to give you a real brief overview of Jewish history during the 400 years of silence, and then we're going to go into a little more of a four-stage examination of life during this 400-year period of silence. The Jews in Jerusalem were there after Ezra and Nehemiah did their work, and people were allowed to go back from the Babylonian captivity. The Greek culture, which came in with Alexander, made an impact all over, and a lot of people were influenced by that, and even so much that the Old Testament then needed to be translated into Greek, and they used the Koine Greek to do that. And what came out of this situation was Hellenistic Jews, or Jews that were influenced by Greek culture. And we do see that word Hellenistic Jews in the book of Acts, in the New Testament. But there was another group called the Hasidic Jews, who were not very happy with the Greek influence on the Jews. And then there was Judas Maccabeus, I'm not sure I'm saying that right. He led a revolt to restore faithfulness. And so in just a minute, we'll get into this four-stage review of the life under the period of 400 years. But just know that there was a man named Judas Maccabeus who led a Jewish revolt to restore faithfulness. And then there was a guy that came along later who was also a Jewish leader, part of that effort to lead the Jews. His name was John Hyrcanus, which brought us up to Herod the Great, who was an Idumean. So let's just go ahead and do a deep dive real quick into into these different phases of Jewish history after the exile. Phase one, Jerusalem was a provincial state of the Persian Empire. We probably remember the stories where the Persians encouraged local loyalties and religions. They allowed Ezra and Nehemiah to go back to Jerusalem to do work on the temple. And at some point, the Persians even started picking up the tab and helping to not only to build it, but also to upkeep the Jerusalem temple. And just need to mention that these four phases of life under the exile, or after the exile, come from Erdman's Family Encyclopedia of the Bible. Phase two, the Persian Empire was overthrown by Alexander the Great, which he was a Greek. Alexander dreamed of spreading Greek culture everywhere. And the Greek Empire eventually divided after Alexander died. And the Greek culture made a huge impact on Jewish religion in the 3rd century BC. And the Old Testament, of necessity, was translated to Greek, mostly for the Jews who were living outside of Palestine. We continue phase 2. The Greek culture had its religions, which they were encouraging, but they also conflicted with the Jewish religion, of course. And these two parties emerged, the Hellenists, which are the Greek influence, and the Hasidim, the conservative Jews who saw incompatibility of the two. And this conflict came to a head under a man named Antiochus IV. He was a Greek leader. And with the support with him and the support of some Jewish families, Antiochus he converted the city of Jerusalem into a Greek city. And in his zeal to do this, he decided to root out Jewish religion, and he forbade Old Testament sacrifices in Jerusalem. He forbade things like circumcision and other things. Well, you can only imagine that the Jews resisted this. Well, it got to the point that Antiochus went to the point he put up a statue of Zeus in the temple, and he also had a pig sacrificed on an altar in the temple. Well, that takes us to phase 3. You can imagine. A revolt ensued, and it was led by a man named Judas Maccabeus. It was a long struggle. Eventually, he drove Antiochus and his followers out of the temple. They built a new temple and replaced the defiled one, new altar and replaced the defiled one. They rededicated the temple, and Judea remained an independent state ruled by priests / kings, and they were called the Hasmoneans. I don't know if you've ever heard that name before, but it's something that I've heard I know much about. Takes us to phase 4. The new phase began when the Roman conquest of the remaining Seleucid Macedonian Empire happened. And in just a minute, I'm going to show you a couple of maps, and hopefully that'll help us to see. There was a Roman general named Pompey. He took Jerusalem in 63 BC. And Judea was from then on ruled directly or indirectly by the Romans. And so Judea again had a king. His name was Herod the Great from 37 to 4 BC. And just so you know, Herod the Great, the name doesn't really fit him all that well, but that's what they call him, Herod the Great. So in this first map, you see this is Judea under the Maccabean period, and the brown area goes up into Galilee, past the Sea of Galilee and up there a little bit. And the yellow is the Seleucid Empire, which the Seleucid Empire is, I think we call the Macedonian area up above the Mediterranean Sea. So this is the life under Judea under the Maccabean period, which was led by the Hasmoneans. And then this is what happened when Pompey came in and took Jerusalem, and then they started conquering the world. So this is the Roman Empire in the days of Christ right here, you see. And so you see that what was formerly done there in Galilee now has turned into the pink, which is the Roman controlled, goes up into Macedonia and over into those areas, goes over all the way to Italy, brings in France and Spain, and goes down northern Africa. So, a little bit about Herod the Great, just a little bit of his brief history. He was the son of a man named Antipater. You may have heard that name. Made procurator of Judea by Julius Caesar in 47 BC. After the death of Antipater and his brother Joseph, governor of Jerusalem, Rome gave Herod the title King of the Jews. And as I mentioned earlier, he reigned as king from 37 to 4 BC. He was hated by the Jews. In spite of enormous amount of money he spent on the temple, he was really not of Jewish origin, but he tried to placate the Jews and make them happy and do what he could. He was a politician through and through. He was not Jewish by birth. He was Idumean, which means Edomite, down there by the Dead Sea. There's a place called Masada down there. That's the area where he is from. It's my understanding that he's like a half Edomite. And so anyway, really not Jewish, although there was a claim that he promoted himself as Jewish in order to get in good with the Jewish folks in Judea. I know you probably can't see this very well, but it's a genealogical chart of the Herodian dynasty. And it shows 4 different generations on the left in the red. And then at the top, there's Herod the Great. And first generation, second generation, third and fourth, and then at the top is Herod the Great. So you'll notice that I put in a heavy line at the top. He had 5 wives, and let's just go to the next slide. These are the 5 wives that Herod had. One, her name was Doris, and then there were 2 named, and I thought this was a misspelled word, Mariamne the first, who was the granddaughter of John Hyrcanus, who was one of those leaders after the Maccabees. And then there's Mariamne the second, who was a daughter of Simon the high priest. So when they reestablished the Jewish religion in Jerusalem at the temple, it was the high priests that were leading the people. And so Mariamne the second was a daughter of a man named Simon the high priest. Herod the Great also had another wife named Malthace and Cleopatra. And this is not Cleopatra from Egypt. This is Cleopatra from Jerusalem. And there's some areas that she was from, Itaria, Trachonitis, Galaritis, and Batanea. And some of these regions are, like you go up the Jordan River, they're on the east side of the Jordan River and up that area. But so we go back to the genealogical chart of the Herodian dynasty here, and you see there's a line that comes down here. This comes down from Mariamne the first, and this is the line that really continues Herod's lineage down into the later parts of the New Testament. But up here, so when Herod Great died in 4, then Herod Antipas took over, and but then you see the other line happen, and it's through a Jewish wife. And so I just want you to see this. I read a lot of things about this, and they said this is one of the hardest genealogical charts to make because it was a mess. You know, they were marrying brothers, wives, and you know, it's just a mess. Anyway, I just want you to see it that the dynasty really gets passed down through a Jewish wife and mother of the kids. And I will mention before we get into looking at Herod, on the far right over here, there's a Herod Philip, I think is this guy here, was the only good son of Herod the Great, who actually was a pleasant person, which kind of leads us into the next. Before we do that, I do want us to get our Bibles out now, and I just want to look at some of these passages, not in depth, but just kind of glance through them, look at these scriptures. These are where the Herods intersect with, it's like where the rubber hits the road, where the Herods intersect with the people. And so let's look at generation 1, Herod the Great, and open up your Bibles to Luke 1 and verse 5. In the days of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zacharias, the division of Abijah. He had a wife from the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. They were both righteous in the sight of God, walking blamelessly in all the commandments and requirements of the Lord, but they had no child because Elizabeth was barren, and they were both advanced in years. And so I won't read any more of that, but we just see that in the days of Herod, This is Herod the Great. This is the original daddy. And so then we go on, and let's flip over to Mark chapter 6, and we're going to read about Herod Antipas, which is his son. Mark chapter 6, verses 14 through 29. So this is a little bit of a longer reading, but I think we got time to do it. And King Herod heard of it, for his name had become well known, and the people were saying, John the Baptist has risen from the dead, and that's why these miraculous powers are at work in him. But others were saying, he is Elijah, and others were saying, he is a prophet, like one of the prophets of old. But when Herod heard of it, he kept saying, John, whom I have beheaded, has risen. For Herod himself has sent and had John arrested and bound in prison on account of Herodias, the wife of his brother Philip, because he had married her. For John had been saying to Herod, it's not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. Herodias had a grudge against him and wanted to put him to death. It could not do so. For Herod was afraid of John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and he kept him safe. And when he heard him, he was very perplexed. But he used to enjoy listening to him. Verse 21, a strategic day came when Herod on his birthday gave a banquet for his lords and military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. And when the daughter of Herodias herself came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his dinner guest. And the king said to the girl, ask me whatever you want, I'll give it to you. And he swore to her, whatever you ask me, I'll give to you, up to half my kingdom. And she went outside and said to her mother, what shall I ask for? She said, the head of John the Baptist. And immediately she came in a hurry to the king and asked, saying, I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter. And although the king was very sorry, yet because of his oaths and because of his dinner guest, he was unwilling to refuse her. Immediately the king sent an executioner and commanded him to bring back his head. And he went and had him beheaded in prison and brought his head on a platter and gave it to the girl, and the girl gave it to her mother. And when his disciples heard about this, they came and took away his body and laid it in the tomb. And there's another account of this in Luke 23. We won't look at that. You learn a little bit here about the son of Herod the Great, don't you? He was not a great guy. Let's look at the next generation, Herod Agrippa. This is over, I told you about that left-hand line through Mariamne. And in Acts 12, if you would flip over to Acts 12. Sorry, I should have had this marked out already. Wasting time. Mark 12. We read about Herod Agrippa the first. Now, about that time, Herod the king laid hands on some who belonged to the church in order to mistreat them. And he had James, the brother of John, put to death with a sword. And when he saw it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. Now, it was during the days of the unleavened bread. And when he had seized him, he put him in prison, delivering him to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him. Intending after the Passover to bring him out before the people. So Peter was kept in the prison, but prayer for him was being made fervently by the church to God. On the very night when Herod was about to bring him forward, Peter was sleeping between 2 soldiers, bound with 2 chains, and guards in front of the door were watching over the prison. And behold, verse 7, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared, and a light shone in the cell. And he struck Peter's side and woke him up and said, get up, quickly. And his chains fell off his hands. And the angel said to him, gird yourself and put on your sandals. And he did so. And he said to him, wrap your cloak around you and follow me. And he went out and continued to follow, and he did not know what was being done by the angel was real, but thought he was seeing a vision. And when they had passed the first and second guard, they came to the iron gate that leads to the city, which opened for them by itself. And they went out and they went along one street, and immediately the angel departed from him. When Peter came to himself, he said, now I know for sure that the Lord has sent forth his angel and rescued me from the hand of Herod and from all that the Jewish people were expecting. And when he realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, who was called Mark, where many were gathered together and were praying. When he knocked at the door of the gate, a servant girl named Rhoda came to answer. When she recognized Peter's voice, because of her joy, she did not open the gate, but she ran in and she announced that Peter was standing in the front of the gate. And they said to her, "You are out of your mind." But she kept insisting that it was so. And they kept saying, "It's his angel." But Peter continued knocking. And when they had opened the door, they saw him, and they were amazed. But motioning to them with his hand to be silent, he described to them how the Lord had led him out of the prison. And he said, "Report these things to James and the brethren." And when he had left and went to another place. Then when the day came, there was no small disturbance among the soldiers as to what could have become of Peter. When Herod had searched for him and not found him, he examined the guards and ordered that they be led away to execution. Then he went down from Judea to Caesarea and was spending time there. I'm going to keep reading to verse 24. Verse 20 is talking about Herod. Now, he was very angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon. And with one accord they came to him, and having won over Blastus, the king's chamberlain, they were asking for peace because their country was fed by the king's country. On an appointed day, Herod, having put on his royal apparel, took his seat on the rostrum and began delivering an address to them. The people cried out, "Oh, the voice of a God and not of a man." And immediately an angel of the Lord struck him because he did not give God the glory, and he was eaten by worms and died. And notice verse 24. But the word of the Lord continued to grow and to be multiplied. We just read about the third generation of Herod, and Herod's dynasty, what kind of a man this was. And yet, in spite of him, it says that the word of the Lord continued to grow and be multiplied. And in the fourth generation of Herod, we read about in Acts 25. Acts 25, I'll just read 13 to 26. Now, when several days had elapsed, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea and paid their respects to Festus. While they were spending many days there, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, "There is a man who was left as a prisoner by Felix, and when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews brought charges against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation against him. And I answered them that it is not the custom of the Romans to hand over any man before the accused meets his accusers face to face and has an opportunity to make his defense against the charges. So after they had assembled there, I did not delay, but on the next day I took my seat on the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought before me. When the accusers stood up, they began bringing charges against him, not of such crimes as I was expecting, but they simply had some points of disagreement with him about their own religion and about a dead man, Jesus, whom Paul asserted to be alive. Being at a loss how to investigate such matters, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial on these matters. But when Paul appealed to be held in the custody of the emperor's decision, I ordered him to be kept in custody until I had sent him to Caesar. And then Agrippa said to Festus, "I would also like to hear the man myself tomorrow." He said, You shall hear him." So on the next day, when Agrippa came together with Bernice and with great pomp and entered the auditorium, accompanied by the commanders and the prominent men of the city, at the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. And I'll just stop there. There's the fourth generation of Herod interacting with. And we know in chapter 26 where Paul makes his defense to Agrippa, and at some point he says, "You almost persuade me to be a Christian." And Paul said, "I wish that not only you, but everybody in my hearing would become a Christian." And so I just wanted to point out these contact points with the Herodian kings or leaders, tetrarchs, whatever they were, with the people, and it's going to happen. And so I've got some quotes here. The question is what did the historians have to say about Herod? Did they like Herod? Did they think Herod's a good person? What do they say about him? I've got a book at home. It's called The Bible is History by Werner Keller. It actually was written in German. It was translated from German to English, 1956. And I don't know where I got it. I think I may have got it at a library book sale, but I'm not sure. But here's some of the things that he had recorded here, and there's a lot of references in this book where these came from. But anyway, this is what he said about Herod. Herod, he was no king, but the most cruel tyrant who ever ascended the throne. He murdered a vast number of people, and the lot of those he left alive was so miserable that the dead might count themselves fortunate. He not only tortured his subjects singly, but ill-treated whole communities. In order to beautify foreign cities, he robbed his own, and he made gifts to foreign nations that were paid for with Jewish blood. He also said, the Jews, demoralized, in utter poverty, within a few years, the Jews suffered more miserably than their forefathers had done in the long period since they left Babylon and returned under Xerxes. Herod was king 36 years. Hardly a day had passed without someone being sentenced to death. He spared no one. His victim list included family, friends, priests, and people. Herod, it said, ruled like a wild beast. His victims included 2 husbands of a sister named Salome, his wife Mariamne, the one whose kids came from that, his sons Alexander and Aristobulus. He killed them. He killed his brother-in-law, that supposedly was in parenthesis, he drowned in the Jordan River. Apparently there was a little help drowning there in the Jordan River. He burned 2 scholars because they removed a Roman eagle that had been placed in the temple. He killed Hyrcanus, the last of the Hasmoneans. He killed noble families. He exterminated them, root and branch. He killed Pharisees. And it says the day before he died, had the old man Antipater and his son assassinated. And then and this is only a fraction of the things that he did. But the last thing that Werner Keller mentioned in this is the massacre of the innocents in Bethlehem. That's the kind of man Herod was. I came across the article in the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia, and it's quotes of Josephus Flavius. His quote about Herod was, afraid to leave a remnant of the Asmonean power alive, he sacrificed Mariamne, his wife, the only human being he'd ever seemed to have loved. He did that in 28 BC. His mother-in-law, Alexandra, he killed her too. And ultimately, shortly before his death, even his own sons by Mariamne, Alexander, and Aristobulus. He did that in 7 BC. He goes on to say that in his emulation of the habits and views of life of the Romans, he continually offended and defied his Jewish subjects by the introduction of Roman sports and heathen temples in his dominion. His influence on the younger Jews in this regard was baneful, and slowly a distinct party arose, partly political, partly religious, which called itself the Herodian party. The Jews in outward religious form, but Gentiles in their dress and in their worldview of life. They were a bitter offense to the rest of the nation, but they were associated with the Pharisees and Sadducees in their opposition to Christ. And so you can see some of the reasons why the Jews hated Herod and the Romans. Another, a man, he was of great barbarity toward all men equally, and a slave to his passions, but above the consideration of what was right. Yet was he favored by fortune as much as any man ever, for from a private man he became a king, and though he were encompassed by 10,000 dangers, he got clear of them all and continued his life to an old age, a very old age. He died when he was 70 years old. The Herods and Jewish hatred. News of Herod's death brought violence and uprisings that were typically unusual in Jewish life. The Jewish uprising was fueled by this hatred of the house of Herod and of the Romans. And the Jews also demanded an atonement for the two scholars that were burned to death. Remember I told you about them removing an eagle from the temple? Well, Archelaus' response, as Herod's son, response was to kill 3,000 Jews and to scatter their remains on the temple courts. He was every bit as cruel as his dad. Herod, going back to the Werner Keller, the Bible's history book, Herod on his deathbed made a will in which he nominated his three sons as his successors. Archelaus was to succeed the kingdom. Herod Antipas was to become Tetrarch of Galilee, and Philip was to become Tetrarch of Perea. So I asked the question, what benefit did the Herodian dynasty serve for the coming King Jesus? As I prepared this lesson on the footsteps of our delving into the life of Christ study, I had an epiphany, and I don't know whether it's real or not, about Herod's dynasty. The dynasty of Herod's family was like a dark cloud hanging over the Jewish mind. They hated the Herods. They hated the Romans. And we read about that in the New Testament, in the Gospels. When Jesus began teaching and discipling followers, there was a bright light. We read about people were just amazed from this light that was emanating from Jesus' teachings. People were amazed. I think the contrast of King Jesus to worldly leaders paints a clear, distinguishable difference and helps us to see the significance of the life and teachings of Jesus and his kingdom. I don't know. You guys have any other thoughts? I mean, I'm sincerely asking, what, John?
Partly from all the stuff that you just listed, but also because of other political things. All the actions of Herod and his sons ultimately led Rome to no longer allow a king in Jerusalem or Judea, but take over.
Yeah.
And basically because of his actions, it was Pilate then who was ultimately given control when it came time for Jesus to be sacrificed.
Mm-hmm.
And that basically elevated this whole issue, not only from a basically Jewish internal conflict,
Mm-hmm.
but it involved the Romans, which then made it a global issue.
Right.
So,
Hmm.
in a sense, I can see it helping to allow the spread of Christianity after Christ's sacrifice.
Okay. That's a good observation. Fred?
Perhaps in a different sense, but all these things going on, I picture kind of like the Israelites in Egyptian slavery. They were ready to be delivered.
Mhm.
They were miserable. It wasn't a situation where they could look around and say, life's not too bad. No, it was
No,
terrible.
it's terrible.
They hated it.
Yeah.
And so, just the situation was right
Yeah.
for someone to come and offer deliverance.
Excellent point. I think that's, both of those points are like nails right on the head. John, Matt, you guys got anything? I tell you, when I was preparing for this, I'm thinking, I don't know what I'm doing here. I'm used to studying a Bible, not an encyclopedia or something. Steve, you got your hand up.
I like your thought about the dark cloud. Herod was also paranoid, and so he had fortresses built in case he was attacked. One of those was at Masada, that you mentioned,
Yeah.
became like a fortress. And I think it's interesting that ultimately, after the fall of Jerusalem, the next, one of the few fortresses left was Masada, which was held by Sicarii, which were essentially zealots,
Hmm.
and a very specific type. They hated Rome, and they even hated some of their Jewish brethren who had become worldly.
Mm-hmm.
And
The Hellenist Jews. Yeah. Yeah.
so,
All right, good. I didn't realize that Masada was a reinforcement that makes sense. Yeah.
So none of this is from the Bible?
Well, the scriptures that I read, but no, this is from history is recorded by men outside of scriptures. Yeah, Josephus.
It's like Gmail, not Gmail, Yahoo.
No, not that.
Okay.
Yeah, it's stuff written, recorded by. Well, I mean, people of history. even King Herod apparently had a guy that was in charge of documenting his history. You know, it's like there were things I read that made me think is like, this is not a whole lot different than what we encounter in modern day culture. You know, you got a king or person in authority, and he's got all kinds of people under him doing these different things. And so same kind of a thing. You got people documenting things, but it's not, it doesn't have the veracity that scriptures have because of lack of numbers of documents and things like that. But anyway, so pretty soon we're going to get into the interactions between Herod's family of leaders and Christ and his followers. And I just want you to imagine, if you will, the groundswell of Jewish folks anticipating a new king, just like what Fred was talking about. Anticipating getting out from under this burden of this awful Herodian dynasty and the Roman oppression and the things that were going to happen. But and with the oppressive dark cloud of Herodian leadership that was hanging over God's people, I see this situation as a thunderstorm of divine will pitted against the wills of political leaders that are tyrants. We would expect to see in a thunderstorm of opposite charges the occasional lightning strike where some people get hurt. Happens even today. We have leaders sometimes that do awful things, and we have all we can do is put up with it, try to bear an influence, do a lot of praying, and yet in this interface between God's divine will, what's happening, and us trying to do what we need to do, sometimes people get hurt. And I think about all the babies that were killed by Herod. I don't know how many it was, but that's just a horrible thing to do, to kill, 2-year-olds, to protect your power. It's just an awful thing. And so I'm really curious. I don't know where this was supposed to go, John and Matt. I hope I've never studied this before, and I've certainly never taught it before, but I really want to know what your thoughts. I've kind of focused on the negative aspect of Herod. He was an amazing builder, and he did build an amazing temple for the Jews. He did a lot of things like that, but I do think that there are, and the last point here, and we're just about done, I want you to think about some New Testament teachings that the Jewish Christians had to deal with and mentally overcome this hatred and prejudice in order to be a disciple of the kingdom of Christ. Pray for your leaders. Love those that hate you. I mean, we're going to get into it pretty soon in the Gospels, in the Sermon on the Mount. And it was revolutionary, the things that Jesus was teaching. And if you were living under that cloud of Herod and that cloud of oppression, and you heard some of these things, you either had to deal with your prejudices and your hatred, or you had to not. And if you didn't, then you would have walked away from Jesus and said, I don't want anything to do with that. But people were so amazed at what he did and said that they just they flocked to him to hear more of what he had to say. So anyway, that's the Herodian dynasty from my perspective, and I hope. Oh, was there a hand? John, sorry.
Well, your last paragraph, what did they have to deal with? And, some things they had to deal with, they had to reject man's philosophies and myths,
Yeah.
as well as many false teachings that were starting to come about.
Yeah.
And of course, even perhaps they had a few false Christs they had to deal with.
Very good. Thank you. Anybody else? All right, very good.